by Jordan Peterson as it was being interviewed by Dennis Prager. Jordan Peterson's a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, a clinical psychologist, the author of multi-million copy bestseller 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. It was #1 for nonfiction in 2018 in the US, Canada, and Great Britain and Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, Netherlands, Brazil, Norway. Now it's in 50 languages. And Jordan Peterson got in lots of trouble in Canada when he spoke out against a bill that they had produced, which was basically he felt compelled speech, not free speech. And he got sort of raked over the coals for it, but he emerged out of it actually stronger and more powerful than ever before. And it's interesting because in this interview he says this fascinating quote: "You can't discover what you're capable of being or withstanding if you hide away from any of the things about life that are terrible but true. The reason you can't discover who you are without doing that is that only necessity will force that out of you." He goes on to say, we know from a biological perspective that if you put yourself in new and challenging situations, that new genes turn on in your nervous system and new codes for new proteins that produce new neurological structures. So you can't even be what you are fully biologically unless you expose yourself to everything that you can expose yourself to as you journey through life. He says you can't be happy. You can't be complete. You can't know what you can withstand. You can't have any proper sense of self-respect unless you know what you can tolerate. And if you avoid everything that you have reason to avoid, but should nonetheless not avoid, you won't know who you are, and then you can't live properly. Fascinating words and advice nobody else gives us. Most advice that's received in modern American culture is how to avoid pain, suffering, hardship, conflict, and sorrow. The vast amount of advice that we receive is how to eliminate those things from your life. And along comes Jordan Peterson, this psychologist who's done many biological and sociological and psychological studies, and he says, oh, no, you don't understand. You have to put yourselves in difficult situations. You have to face the monster in your life so that you can become who you're truly supposed to be. And when you do that, not only does something unlock in your mind and in your soul and in your spirit, but literally physiological changes take place. Your very genes change and transform when you face the monster. And in facing the monster, you unlock who you're really supposed to be. I think that's incredibly, well, it's profound, it's wise, it's insightful, and the core, I think even as you hear it, you know it's true. And yet most of us will spend far more energy avoiding the monster, running from the conflict, hiding from the problem, trying to find the safe place and the safe space that we could live in where no harm ever comes to us, nothing ever irritates us, no offense ever happens. And Jordan Peterson's come along and said, that's the wrong way to live life. It's interesting because as I read through the New Testament, many times I run across people, individuals, characters who had to face the monster. They had to face who they really were in the midst of the conflicts that they had. And typically, when I read through the stories, I kind of like the stories where Jesus comes along and presto, changeo, prayer, spoken word, bam, it's all healed and all taken care of and all fixed. And that's the Christianity I want. I want the Christianity where Jesus shows up and he basically speaks a word and all the conflict disappears and all the problems go away. And you want that too. And yet that's often not the Christian life, is it? In fact, what we see in the Christian life is Jesus putting us through difficulties, through hardship. Or this often happens. Sometimes we live in the pain and the suffering and the difficulty for so long, for so many years, that it actually becomes who we are. We identify in the pain and the suffering and the conflict and the brokenness and the wounds and the betrayal, and we take on the spirit of the victim that has emerged, and that victimhood becomes our actual identity. And then Jesus comes along and he speaks that victimhood and he calls something different out of it, and we have to face that monster. As I was reading through the Gospel of John, the story, we're doing it chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and going through the Gospel of John, in John chapter 5, right off the bat, there's this little story that if you've been in Christian very long, you've heard it. It was an old Sunday school story. If you're kind of new to the faith, you'll learn that this is kind of one of those top easy stories. And I'm thinking, oh, that will be easy to preach. I've heard this story. I've used this story. I've referenced this story in conversations. I've used examples of this story. This is kind of one of those generic universal stories that we use to talk about Jesus doing healing miracles. It's phenomenal. But the more I studied it, the more I looked at it, the more complicated the story got, the more confusing the story was, and the more I walked away with questions than answers. If you'll turn with me to John chapter 5, I'll read you the story. We'll read it together, and we'll try to unpack it today. And I really, honestly, have absolutely no idea what I'm going to really say today. So I'm praying the Holy Spirit will take over, because I was, like I said, left with questions. John chapter 5, verse 1. We provide these Bibles. If you want to use one of these, it'll be page 1078. And you can read along here. John 5, verse 1. It says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water, and then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Now a certain man was there who had had an infirmity for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, do you want to be made well? And the sick man answered him, sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred, but while I am coming, another steps down before me. And Jesus said to him, rise, take up your bed and walk. And immediately the man was made well. He took up his bed and he walked. And that day was the Sabbath. And the Jews therefore said to him, who was cured, it is the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to carry your bed. And he answered them, he who made me well said to me, take up your bed and walk. And then they asked him, who was the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. And the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Let's pray. Lord, I ask by your Spirit that you speak through this story to us. You were there. You did this. You made sure that it was recorded so that we would have it to study. And so now, Lord, teach us and show us, tell us, what was really going on there. And help our minds and spirits to unlock the truth that you have for us out of this story with that man you met so long ago. We ask your Spirit to infuse your word and to infuse us so that we can understand with spiritual eyes, spiritual hearts, what you're trying to say to us. We ask in your holy name. Amen. It's an interesting story. It begins that after these things, so he had just done a miracle in Galilee, and now he's going back up to Jerusalem. If you read the Gospel of John, it's like he keeps bouncing back and forth. He's in Jerusalem. No, he goes to Galilee. No, he's back to Jerusalem. And that's a 70-mile journey. So it's not like an easy thing to do. But every time there's a feast, every time there's a holy holiday that has to be done, Jesus honored it. And if in the Old Testament, the Jewish men were told, you need to come to the Feast of Pentecost, you need to come to the Feast of Tabernacles, you need to come to Passover in Jerusalem, Jesus always honored those things. And so somehow another feast has taken place, and scholars will debate whether this is Pentecost, Tabernacles, or Passover, but it doesn't seem relevant to the story other than he showed up to do his religious obligation to honor God and worship through this feast. And so he goes to Jerusalem. He's made the 70-mile journey. And there in Jerusalem is this pool called the Pool of Bethesda. And actually, this is a picture of what it looks like in modern days. That is the Pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem. And over the centuries, it's been built up. Crusaders built churches on top of it and walls and built up. So it doesn't look at all like when Jesus was there. But we do know one thing. At the Pool of Bethesda, it says there were 5 colonnades or patios or porches. We're not quite sure how to translate the word. It's these big, huge platforms made out of stone and marble, and then they would put columns up and they would put a roof over it. And there were 5 of them that surrounded this Pool of Bethesda. And all over those patios, that colonnade, those porches, were hundreds and hundreds. In fact, it says a great multitude of sick, diseased, blind, lame, crippled, injured, wounded. That's who was there. And they lay there at the Pool of Bethesda, and it's interesting because Pool of Bethesda has this dual meaning, and scholars try to unpack it. It actually means house of mercy. But because of the way Hebrew worked, which one word can mean so many different things, it also could be translated house of shame or disgrace. So it's like, well, this is the place where the shameful and the disgraceful people gather because in hope that they might receive mercy. And then this archaeological digs that were conducted in the 19th century discovered this large tank. It was situated about 100 feet northwest of St. Anne's Church. And archaeologist Conrad Schick contended it was the Pool of Bethesda. Further archaeological excavation in the area in 1964 uncovered the remains of the Byzantine and Crusader churches. Hadrian's temple of Asclepius, that was their god of healing, and the small healing pools of Asclepius were there. They found the second of two large pools, the dam between them. It was discovered that the Byzantine construction was built in the very heart of Hadrian's construction, containing these two healing pools. So that's what they have found. And it's interesting because they get there, and I'm thinking this, like how many of you, if you're going to go visit New York City, are like, I want to make sure I get to Harlem and see the slums, right? I've only got 2 days in New York, right? I got 2 days to spend in Chicago, and there's plenty of sights to see. I better make sure I get to the south side of Chicago and see the ghetto. None of us are going to do that, right? You're going to go to Jerusalem, you're going to see the sights, you're going to go to the temple, you're going to see the stuff that's built, you're going to see maybe some Roman construction. Sure, the last place that you would want to go as a tourist is to the Pool of Bethesda, where the sick, the infirm, the lame, the diseased, the dying are there, desperately hoping for a chance to get out of it. But that's where Jesus goes. And I don't know if he had his little entourage with him. It doesn't really say in the text that his disciples were with him or not. By this time, he already had them, so I'm assuming they're traveling with him. So I think John's walking along with him, behind him, and we'll remember this story many, many years later as he records it for this gospel. We'll remember this story. It was a very meaningful thing for some reason to the Apostle John. And Jesus goes to Jerusalem, and instead of hanging out with the crowds and the people that are powerful and the people that are popular and the people that are influential, he goes down to that pool where the sick and the lame, the diseased are dying. And some reason this pool, and since archaeologists have discovered there's an underground spring that comes to it, and it'll occasionally bubble up with the feed of this underground spring, but it had become known, and I'm going to say known, that they saw it as angels stirring the water. Now, some of your Bibles will have this verse 3 and verse 4, but some of your Bibles won't, because what had happened in early on in the New Testament, John would write common knowledge. So he just said they were laying at the Pool of Bethesda, and since he's writing to a group of people who understood Jerusalem, it was common knowledge what Bethesda was, right? In fact, I say Bethesda now, most of you immediately think Naval Hospital, right? There's a name for it, common knowledge. Well, as this Holy Bible was being translated and sent and moved along, there came a point at some time in history when a scholar or a scribe knew that, well, he says this, but no one knows why these guys are laying at the pool. So I'm going to add a note in the margin. So on the borders of the scroll, he would write, the reason that they were lying there was because sick, diseased, lame people, the first guy to get in the water after an angel stirred it, got healed. So now you know. And then somehow, centuries later, copy after copy, someone had taken that margin note and slipped it in and added those verses to make it explainable. It's still truth. It's why they were there and tells you what was going on. But it may have not been in John's original gospel. Okay, not going to fight about that. It's one of the handful of tiny passages that takes place, but it's still true. And so what's interesting, as I'm looking at this, is like modern era would say, oh, and it was just superstition, right? And I'm like, really? If it was just superstition, they would have laid there after the first 3 guys jumped in the water and didn't get healed, and everybody would have gone home. Let's be honest. Why are they still gathering there? Because periodically they saw the miracle happen. Every now and then that water would stir and bubble, and the first person in would get healed. That's what made the multitude come. That's why they stayed. That's why they hung out, because guess what? It wasn't just superstition. They watched it work. Why God did it that way, I don't know. But that's how God did it in that moment. And so they're hanging out there, and Jesus goes down, and he's among these sick, diseased, lame, paralyzed, blind people who are waiting for the moving of the water. And there's one guy in the crowd who for 38 years has been, we don't know what he's been. We're assuming crippled. We're assuming paralyzed at some point. And for 38 years, we don't know if he's been lying by the pool for 38 years, which it seems to indicate that's been his pattern, or whether he's been paralyzed or crippled for 38 years. And it could be a combination of both, because some people think that the opening passage, when it says that makes that at a certain time the waters would stir, it meant there were only certain seasons in which this pool was good for healing. And so when those seasons happened, all the sick came from all over the place, and they laid there waiting for that moment, and then when the season ended, they would go home. And it may have been that. But regardless, this guy has been there before. And for 38 years, he has tried this method. He has wanted this healing. He's gone to the pool of Bethesda, and maybe he lives in Jerusalem. Maybe this is his place. Maybe he hangs out there. I don't know. But he lays by the pool, and then along comes Jesus, and he asks him this question. Do you want to get well? I just read an article yesterday about a restaurant in Texas that charges people a 38-cent surcharge for asking stupid questions. When you ask a stupid question on the receipt, you'll get a 38-cent charge for asking a stupid question, right? And I know those of you in the restaurant industry right now are going, that is a marvelous idea, right? And I got to think, when you're looking at this group of people lying by this pool, trying to get in, and then Jesus says, do you want to get well? That strikes me as stupid question, right? And yet Jesus is far from stupid. Why does he ask that question? In fact, as I've read this story over my lifetime, that's the way I read it, right? Do you want to get well? The man says, sir, I have no one to put me in the water when the water stirs. I don't think that's how Jesus asked the question. I think how Jesus asked the question was this: do you want to get well? Whoa, wait. Just that phrasing changes the whole meaning of what Jesus was saying, doesn't it? In other words, what Jesus was asking is, do you really want your life to be different? Do you really want to be transformed? Do you really want the thing that you are pretending that you want? Do you want why you say you're coming? Or is the truth that you really like the condition you're in? You've grown so comfortable in this status and this state, in this position of society, and coming here year after year, month after month, or maybe living here all the time, and you've got your little network of guys, and everybody has their territory, and everybody knows that spot's your bed spot, and you know everybody who sits around you, and you play cards together all day long, waiting for the water to stir, because this has actually become who you are. And so when Jesus asks, do you want to get well? He's asking the man, do you want your entire life to change? Everything you're pretending that you want, do you really want it? I think that's what Jesus is saying. And the man, I notice he doesn't say, well, yes, that's why I'm here. Notice he doesn't say that. In fact, what he says is the default excuse he's been using for 38 years. For 38 years, he's told people, yeah, well, I'm going there to get well, but, no one ever, I can't get down to the pool because, you got to get someone to drag you down there when you're crippled to get you in that water fast. So you need 2 or 3 healthy people who will get you in that water. Otherwise, you're crippled. You can't make it down there. And so, that's my problem is other people won't help me. And since other people won't help me, I don't have a chance, and I have to remain a cripple hanging out by the pool of Bethesda because that's who I am. I'm the cripple by the pool of Bethesda, and I'm waiting for someone else who will help me. I'm waiting for someone else who will change my life for me. When you read the text, though, all the information's there, isn't it? If you read the text and you realize, wait, okay, you've been there for 38 years, and you're so helpless you can't move around. How'd you go to the bathroom? How'd you go to the bathroom? Let's be honest. You had enough strength to crawl out and get to the bathroom, or hobble out and get to the bathroom every time you needed to. How'd you eat? How'd you eat? Did you leave the pool of Bethesda and go to the market and buy some food and come back and lay down on your mat? Did you have friends who brought you food? Did you have friends who came and carried you when you needed to go to the bathroom? How did you live if you were so desperately needy from other people? Because when you read the text, the answer's already there. You could either do it yourself or you already had the friends. So what's really going on here? What's really going on here, right? When you look at it, it's interesting. He either had the strength to move himself, or he had friends who would help him move or get him food. But yet, whenever the water stirred, I have no one to help me get down to the pool in time, and someone else always gets in before me. And then my question is, well, then why did you stay? If you knew it was a helpless, hopeless situation, if you knew this wasn't ever going to be the answer for your life because you couldn't get to the pool fast enough, why did you continue to go there year after year, month after month, week after week, day after day, hanging out by the pool, waiting in a hopeless situation you could never win at? Unless it had become your identity. Unless you began to embrace the role of being a cripple. Unless this had become who you are. And it's interesting because I have watched in my years as a Christian how many people, Christians and non-believers alike, have the built-in ready-made excuse. I'm this way and it's someone else's fault. I'm the way I am, and if someone else would do something, I would be a different person. I have seen this over and over. I have seen this with addicts who are waiting for someone else to rescue them from their addiction. And you can usually tell with the addict whether they're ever going to have any hope or not because they say things like, I can do this myself. The moment the addict says, I'm going to do it myself, you're like, oh, you actually haven't come to terms with how bad you really are. If you can fight this yourself and you're now, 10 years an addict, if you'd have had the strength to do this, you would have. You actually aren't willing to go to the places you need to go, to do the things you need to do, to attend the meetings you need to meet, to talk to the people you need to talk to so that you can change. You really think you have the strength, and you don't have the strength, and we all know you don't have the strength, and even you know you don't have the strength, but you're still using that same old excuse and that same old lie. Do you want to get well? Oh yeah, but I could do it myself. Right? Well, you'll never be well. I've seen this with people who are dealing with depression or anxiety. At first they get, really torn because they live in this state of absolute torn down, dejected depression. And they can't seem to function or even get out of bed. They can't seem to get through a day. Or they live in absolute abject fear and they won't try anything new. And you can barely get people out of their house and they only go to the super comfortable places where they are. And anything that makes them uncomfortable, they run away and go back and retreat to the home or retreat to the place where they know it's their safety zone. Until actually this becomes their identity. And they say, well, I have anxiety. Oh, I have depression. And that leads to, I'm a depressed person. Oh, I'm a person who has anxiety. This is who I am now. It's not a actually diagnosed disorder that I am trying to fight. I'm no longer fighting a disorder. The disorder has become who I am. It is my order. It is my identity. It is my place. And sometimes you can tell because early on they may or may not go to a counselor. They may or may not see someone, a therapist, to help them through that. And if they aren't willing to even go see a therapist, then part of the thing is, then you intend to live in this status. Sometimes they'll go to see a therapist, and I'm always intrigued, and I'll have these conversations like, really? So you've been seeing a therapist for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years for this disorder that you have. Let me ask you a question. What books have you read on depression? What books have you read on anxiety? Who is the best clinical psychologist out there on YouTube who has said one of the coolest things? What videos have you watched? And oftentimes I'm amazed at how I haven't read any books. I haven't looked at any YouTube articles. I haven't read any magazine articles. It's like, do you want to get well? Or are you loving the fact that now you're creating this world of disorder that you have, and you're expecting all of your friends and all of your families and all the new people who meet you to now relate to you through your disorder? And I've seen that a lot. And the answer is, yeah, that's what they are. I need you to change your world to relate to me on my disorder terms. Well, it's called a disorder for a reason, right? It's something that is wrong that needs healing. And There are success stories about there are people who've healed it. And if you aren't willing to read a book or even look at a magazine article or do YouTube discovery, do anything to discover who's been healed from this, then the answer to the question, do you want to get well? The answer is no. I'm kind of liking who this is. I've seen this with people who had some childhood PTSD. I didn't know this until I began doing a little bit of research on it. I knew a fellow once who made everybody relate to him by his PTSD. And I talked to him at length about his childhood, and I've heard some horrific stories of childhood abuse. This guy was nowhere near people I knew who were functioning, strong, powerful people who'd been through 10 times worse than he'd been through. So I didn't quite know how to measure this. But I did know that he enjoyed using his PTSD for any kind of conflict moment or anything he felt uncomfortable with or anything that irritated him. He could say, well, I have PTSD, so you can't do that. You can't, my PTSD, I'm going to go. You can't talk to me like that. I have PTSD, right? Jordan Peterson in the same video will do a whole talk, this video that he does with Dennis Prager. He says, well, scientists have studied, did you know that PTSD is a condition that only naive people suffer from? What? Naive people. He said the studies are out there. So people who think the world should be a certain way are shocked when it isn't. And when they think the world is all good and healthy and happy, and they come up against evil, they don't know how to respond to it. And soldiers in war who get PTSD, the biggest thing that shocks them is not what the enemy does, it's what they do. The PTSD that they feel is they had never come to terms with their own evil. How dark can they be? And he says that naivete of understanding how the world works is actually what makes people PTSD. Not all the time, but this is the studies that are showing, coming out. And yet many times people will say, this is how I've been diagnosed, this is my disorder, this is my thing, and now I want everybody who meets me to relate to me through my disorder. And I think Jesus comes along to all of us and says, you want me to heal that? And quite frankly, the answer with an awful lot of people is no. I kind of got my zone, I got my place, I got my comfortable bed that I'm lying on here. I know who's around me. They know who I am. We've swapped stories enough. This is my place. This is my zone. This is who I am. And I'm here pretending it should be different, wishing life was different, talking to everybody like the day when life will be different and I won't suffer anymore. But the truth is I have no intention of being different than this. I need to come to terms with Jesus. What would happen? And Jesus looks at the man, and this story starts to unpack here for me. I mean, you think about this. How many sick people are around Jesus in this moment? A multitude. How many of them is he going to bother to talk to? One. How many is he going to bother to heal? One. Is the one he's going to bother to heal worth it? Somehow he is to Jesus. No clue in the text to us why. How come Jesus doesn't walk down to the pool of Bethesda? After all, he's going to proclaim his divinity. He's going to start letting people know who he is. How come he doesn't just go, all of you be well? The power goes out, everybody gets up, walks away from the pool. He doesn't bother to do that. I was talking to my wife about this last night as I was hammering through this passage and saying, this bothers me because when we talk about helping impoverished people or helping sick people or helping people in third world countries, we see the group. We talk about the homeless. We talk about the people who are struggling with an issue. We talk about all the villages in Africa. We talk about those suffering with AIDS. We talk about the group and what can we do to salvage and save the entire group. What kind of movement can we do that would take the group of people who are suffering and create systems and programs and organizations that would save the group? And Jesus walks into the group and says, not really interested in the group, but him. I'm here for him. That bothers me. Does it bother you? I mean, I'm kind of like, Jesus, what about everybody else laying around? Only Jesus knows. See, only Jesus knows something. Only Jesus knows if they received a healing, who's going to honor God? If they received a healing, what would their lives become? Better works. If they received a healing, how many of these people will be blessings to others and how many of them will be a curse to others? How many of these people will give thanks and gratitude and praise to God. How many of these people's heart and mind would be transformed if they received the healing? And Jesus sitting amongst that multitude of people, I can surmise, he looked around and said, just that one. So I'm not going to heal them all. I'm going to heal that one. Because out of this multitude of people, that guy right there is the only one who will thank God for it. That guy's the only one who will turn his life around. That guy's the only one who will transform the way he deals with other people. That guy's the only one whose character will become something new and become a blessing. And all the others won't. In his wisdom, in his foreknowledge, in his ability to grasp the future, Jesus sits amongst a multitude of sick people and picks one guy to heal. Half of that bothers me. Half of that I understand. I sit there and I look at it and I think, I don't know. And then he says to this man, it's just interesting. He says, where's the passage where he gives the word? He says, oops, mine flipped over to John 7. That's why I couldn't see it. You know, the man, when he says, do you want to be made well? Notice the man doesn't even say yes. The man simply gives his excuse. Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water stirred up, but while I'm coming, another steps down before me. So, he's tried to crawl. He doesn't say, yes, I want to be made well. He just gives his standard excuse. And Jesus said to him in verse 8, rise, take up your bed and walk. And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. I think this is an interesting moment. Because in this moment, the question becomes, when is he healed? When is he healed? Is he healed when Jesus speaks the word? Or is he healed when he actually does the action? And it's maybe splitting hairs. It's kind of right there. It's like happening, boom, right there. Right? When Jesus speaks the word goes out in power, and the word creates, and the word makes things. It has been since Genesis 1, John chapter 1, and God spoke, and it was created. And the word went out and made things. When Jesus speaks the word, rise, take up your bed and walk, the power is released. And it says, immediately he's made well, and he does this, but I wonder, does he lay there and feel it? Do his legs tingle? Does something happen? Or is just some massive determination from the power of the spoken word that Jesus had make him start moving, and the moment he starts moving, then he feels the healing? I wish it would have unpacked that better for us. John let it lie there. And I think, in my mind, as I read this passage, I think at some point, the healing becomes powerful and meaningful the moment he takes the action of obeying Jesus. He moves. He doesn't sit there and say, okay, I heard you speak and I felt a little something. Now Jesus, pick me up. Hey, friends that are around me, I think maybe I've been cured as I'm laying on my bed, but I'm not sure. Someone pick me up. And if someone will pick me up and stand me on my feet, then I'll trust enough to gather up my bed. I see him taking action right on the spoken word of Jesus. The action has to be on his part. He's not waiting for someone else to pick him up. Jesus doesn't reach down and grab him by the hand and pull him up. Jesus speaks and stands there. And the man has to take some action on his own part for this healing to become genuine to him. And he says, take up your mat. Rise, take up your mat. Now, imagine the scene, right? Because it doesn't play out in the text. The text, oftentimes the Bible says, I'll tell you what happened. If you really look at it and think about it, you will understand it. Sometimes he just gives us but think about it. For 38 years, this guy laid on this bed, and everybody around him knew him, right? And they're going to watch Jesus stand over him, speak a word, and they're going to watch him get up, grab his mat, roll it up. What do you think happened next? You think in the next instant, nobody noticed? Or do you think in the next instant, immediately, everybody around him was like, whoa, Bob, were you lying all this time? Were you cheating? I thought you were, or other people going, no, I knew you were a cripple. I've seen you. I think the whole crowd around him starts to rise up and go, whoa, what is this? And he picks up his bed and he starts to walk out there, and everybody's like, you've been here 38 years. We've watched you crawl in and out of here all the time, and now you're walking. I think immediately a whole tumult starts to happen right there. There's no way that goes unnoticed. Rise, take up your bed and walk. And I'm wondering to myself, why does Jesus tell him to take his bed? Because two things. One is it's going to get the man in trouble because it's a Sabbath day. And the Jewish law says you can't carry a burden on the Sabbath day. So Jesus is already going to violate the Jewish law. Why does he tell him to take his bed? Right? And I start looking at that and say, that seems kind of silly. Like, why don't you just rise, walk, get out of here, go live your life? But Jesus, I think, as I've looked at it, I said, why would he tell him to take his bed? And I think, well, one is, Jesus knows there's going to be this confrontation with the Jewish leaders that's about to happen over that. But I think the other thing is this. He says, you know what that bed represents? That bed represents your place in this hole with these people and that identity. And I don't want you ever coming back here again. I don't want you leaving the bed behind. I don't want you thinking that somehow this is your place even though you're healed. When you get up and you walk out of here as a healed man, you're going to move into a new healed life. You're not going to come back to this old life, talking the same old conversations you had, doing the same old things you did, sitting there waiting for the waters to stir with the same old buddies you always had. Get this bed, pick it up, get out of here because you're never coming back to this place. I think that's partly what's going on. I think that bed represents his comfort in the place of pain. It was the piece of comfort that he brought with him to make him comfortable in his painful place. And Jesus is like, yeah, no more comfort in the painful place. Pick up that bed, get it out of here. You're not going to ever have that again. So he picks it up, he walks out with it, and he's walking. And I have no idea where this guy would be going. I don't even know if we don't know if he lives in Jerusalem. We don't know if he has a home there. We don't know. He's walking around carrying, and it would have been like a mattress, like a really thin, like a thick blanket rolled up. It might have had reeds that were in it, like a grass kind of thing. But he rolls it up, he throws it over his shoulder, he carrying it around, right? And you think, if you've been crippled for 38 years and you're carrying something around, you are not just walking, are you? 38 years, you're like, whoa. Whoa, woohoo, woohoo, look at me, right? Woo! And I can imagine him walking down the streets, and this is what he's doing, drawing attention to himself. I don't think he's just casually strutting, right? Maybe he's getting his balance, maybe he's falling down, I don't know. Whatever it is, he don't look like everybody else walking around that day. And the Jewish leaders come up to him, and after this guy's been there for 38 years, they're like, hey, it is illegal for you to carry a burden on the Sabbath day, which is true in the Old Testament. Actually, what the Old Testament says is not to carry a load out of your house, Jeremiah. And so they had come up with, well, what does that mean? And so after God had spoken and the prophet had spoken and the rule was given not to work on the Sabbath and not to carry a load on the Sabbath day, that's all God said, they had worked out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of codes for what constituted a load. How much weight could you carry? And it was so bizarre. They even had the discussion of, if you have false teeth, can you carry those on a Sabbath day? If you have a wooden leg, can you carry that on a Sabbath day? I mean, that's how their codes had gotten so worked out. But they had figured out that carrying your mattress that might weigh over 10 pounds is carrying a load. And it is illegal. Not only is it illegal, it's unrighteous before God. If you carry your mattress, your little blanket on a Sabbath day, it is actually a sin against God. And God will not like you, and God will punish you, and God won't be favorable. So we're going to make it illegal for you to sin against God by carrying your blanket on the Sabbath day. Right? They had worked all that out. So as this guy's walking down the street, the Jewish leaders, whose job is to enforce the rules, are like, hey, you can't carry that on a Sabbath day. Don't you know it's a Sabbath day? Don't you know that's what's going on here? And I love this because the man, he says, he's the sick man, he said, verse 12, he says, he answered them, he who made me well said to me, take up your bed and walk. So I'm guessing the conversation was a little bit longer than that. The real conversation, John just recorded the outcome, right? The conversation would have been something more like, well, I'm carrying the mat because this is the mat that I've had at the pool of Bethesda for the last 38 years. I've been a cripple. Up until an hour ago, I was completely crippled. And I've been crippled for 38 years and I couldn't walk. And suddenly a guy came and he healed me. And I'm only carrying this thing because he told me this. He who told me to carry this bed and healed me is the one that's why I'm carrying it. And I think the man's thinking, If that dude had power to cure a crippled man for 38 years, he must know something about God y'all don't know. He must have a favor with God none of you have, because he had a power of God none of you have ever exhibited. And I think that's what the man's thinking. So if he said it's okay to carry my mat, I'm going to trust that it's okay to carry my mat, and God's not going to get mad at me. And the Jewish leaders, the ones who is to keep the institution, the law, this is interesting. In verse 12 it says, then they asked him, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? Interesting question. Not, who is the man who healed you? Not, who is the man who cured you? Not, who is the man who has all this power? No, who is the man who's breaking our rules? And I think Jesus saw that one coming a mile away. I think Jesus was, in some ways he said to this guy, take up your pallet and walk, because not only are you going to get healed and cured, but there's something wrong in the whole religious system, and I'm going to break it down, and you're going to help me, pal. And all you got to do is carry your mat. You're going to help me break down this broken, evil, wicked religious system that can't even see a miracle when it stares at it in the face. They're so hooked up on their stupid little rules. And so pick up your mat, follow it, I'll take care of the rest. And he does. And the story ends with this interesting, I don't even know what to do with this. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple. There's our clue right there. Not Jesus found him at the local dive bar throwing back a few pints. Not Jesus found him coming out of the brothel on 3rd and 4th Avenue, right? Not Jesus found him throwing dice in the back alley with some old friends. Jesus finds this man in the temple. The place he was forbidden by law to go to. For all 38 years he was a cripple. He could never go to worship God. He was disqualified and outlawed as a social reject from ever entering into the house of God, to come before God, to pray, to worship, to honor God. And when Jesus finds this man, he's in the temple, worshiping, praising God, doing the thing he could never do before. Entering into the sacred place where God is, to enter into worship. And Jesus had walked through all of Jerusalem, which, at this point would have been tens of thousands of people on a high holy holiday, and he finds the guy. Jesus came looking for him. Jesus remembered who he was. He didn't forget about him. He comes looking for the guy, and he sits down in the temple to have this conversation with him. He says, you've been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. Oh, scholars don't know what to do with that verse. I don't know what to do with that verse. Some scholars say, well, whatever made him a cripple must have been a sin in his younger days. Probably a wild guy. Too much chariot racing and whiskey drinking. Who knows, right? What did he do, right? Fall off of your donkey in a barroom brawl or something, in a drunken stupor, and you got crippled that way? He must have done a sin that caused this. And so now Jesus is saying, hey, don't go do that sin again. Is that what Jesus is saying? I don't think so. Some people say, well, maybe it was just all psychosomatic, right? He had this guilt complex from some sin that he did. And over that guilt complex, that's all that happened. Jesus spoke a word and he got up. But when you read the text and Jesus doesn't say, hey, that thing that you said your sins are forgiven. He never says that to him in the passage. Jesus says, take up your pallet and walk. And as cripple, so he rises and walks. Was it a sin issue that had made him a cripple? Or at this point, here's my view right now. You could change my mind if you were good at reading the text and convincing me. I think the sin was in how he handled his pain. I think his sin was in how he dealt with his condition. His sin was not in chasing God, finding God, looking for God. His sin was in taking on the role of this broken victim and saying it's everybody else's fault that I'm here. And unless someone else does something, I'm stuck here doing this, being this way. I think that was his sin. I think Jesus was calling out at him his mental mindset of becoming conditioned to identifying himself solely and only as as a cripple laying by the pool of Bethesda, waiting for a chance to get in the water with no possible hope because nobody would help him. And I think that was the sin. Jesus was saying, don't ever go back to that again. Your identity is not in your brokenness. Your identity is not in your disorder. Your identity is not in your psychological assessment or your diagnosis. Your identity is not in the pain and suffering your body has. Your identity is not in your disease. Your identity is not in your social condition of where you are in the social structure of power and control in society or how much wealth you have. Your identity is not in those things. If you don't start seeing yourself as nothing other than as a child of God, you have the wrong identity. And that's the sin that Jesus is referring to. Go and sin no more. Stop identifying yourself as a broken, disordered, psychologically, physically dysfunctional person and making other people that you meet relate to you that way. Stop it. And you're like, I don't know how to stop it. I could just lay by the bed waiting for my turn. And read books. Look at magazine articles. Find out who has battled your battle and come out and won in victory. Somebody's been there ahead of you, and the power of Jesus is available to you. And then Jesus says, sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. I don't know what would be worse than lying by the pool of Bethesda for 38 years with a bunch of cripples. You know, what would be worse than that? Losing your soul. Losing the life God intended for you. Losing the hope that He had for you. And for every physical ailment and condition we have out there in society, we'll find somebody who has overcome. You know, people, born without arms and legs are internationally known speakers now. Right? Somebody's always out there who has achieved and done something, who has overcome obstacles that are massively huge. For every childhood ACE trauma, adverse childhood experience that you have had, somebody else has also had it and they've won. Find their stories. Find out what they did. For every disease that you have picked up in your body, if that's the case, somebody's been through the journey before you and they've won. Somebody's been through the journey before you and died, but died with power and dignity and hope and joy. Somebody's been there before you who's been depressed. Somebody's been there before you who suffered from anxiety. Somebody has been there before you who has been every condition you've had in life. They've been there before you and they've won. Find their stories. Learn from them. And sin no more, lest you experience a worse life than what you have now. I think that's what Jesus is telling us in this John chapter 5 story. Would you stand with me as we close in prayer? Oh, Jesus. The more I get to know you, the more mysterious you are. And just when I think I've got you pinned down and I've got you figured out and I understand you, I see you differently and I know you are more mysterious. You are unpredictable. And all I can trust is that in your absolute infinite wisdom and power, that your unpredictability has a pattern that makes sense in a higher plane and a higher order. And I need to trust in that. And so, Lord, for all of us standing today who are facing our fears, who are facing our brokenness, who are remembering our hurts and our pains and our wounds and our betrayals, for those of us who are standing here sick and diseased, we stand here and we say, I trust you. And we vow, Lord, that our identity will be in you. And not in our pain, not in our sorrow, not in our sin, not in our suffering. But we will need you to speak your word over us. Your word that says, rise, take up your pallet and walk. Or for some of us, the word that says, endure, I have my grace, which will be sufficient for you. or your word that says, I have something to teach you, that you will become physically, genetically, socially, spiritually more powerful than you ever could imagine if you will walk this journey with me. So, Lord, we trust you. We stand here trusting you and saying, do your work in us and make us strong. Make us strong for what you have made us for, because what you've made us for is not life on this earth, but life in eternity in heaven. And may our lives become a blessing to others. Through the pain and the suffering that we have been through, may you use it to make our lives a blessing to others. We ask this in the power and the name of the Most High God, who when he speaks, the mountains skip like calves, who has all the power and the authority of the universe to make it so. And in your name we pray. Amen.